conditional offer and basically was told, as soon as you graduate with your degree, you're now able to start with us in the cyber field. So that's exactly what I did. So I worked in the US government in cybersecurity for just over 2.5 years before I came to Dragos, and really, really, really loved the work that I did there. I am somebody who doesn't like to sit still. So I was constantly, volunteering for additional things on top of my job duties and just trying to learn as much as I possibly could and just be a sponge and absorb as much knowledge as I could about cybersecurity. So I was involved in many different projects, a lot of which centered around my experience in incident response and planning for an incident response and leading teams that had to get their boots on the ground to perform incident response. I helped lead vulnerability assessments, pen testing assessments across the government space, and then your kind of proactive threat hunting as well. I also did network defense analysis for some time in the government as well, which sort of fed into sort of my larger sort of cyber planning role, if you will. And all of that was really great. I got to work on policy that was coming out of the White House for incident response plans across the government, and really got some unique experiences and exposure on that side of things. So I got to a certain point where I was like, really liking everything that I was doing. However, the sort of repetitiveness of, IT is always having incident response happen. If you look in the news every day, any number of articles you look at are going to say, oh, so-and-so was hacked and this person was hacked. And you just keep seeing that over and over and over again. And then as you start to dig deeper into that, you're like, okay, well, they were hacked and it was over something simple, right? The password, security controls, all these things that are just like, come on, guys. Like, there's so many things out there as far as resources go to tell you as an organization or a business or a company or whomever, this is how you stay secure. And if you can't even do that, then what are you doing? And it's just, security is a challenge in general. So what I found is, I've always had a sweet spot for critical infrastructure, and I knew that in the back of my head. I just didn't know, what did that path in cyber look like? And that was kind of what I started pursuing towards the tail end of my time in the government. I basically started taking some online classes. There's a lot of free ones that CISA offers online. If you've checked those out before, if industrial is something interesting to you all, highly recommend. I can send you some of those resources. So I just started researching, going online, looking more and more into industrial. And I ended up taking a cyber threat intel class that was taught by the CEO at Dragos. And as soon as I heard kind of his background and just what he was saying as part of the SANS course, I was like, you know what, I'm sold. I want to work for this company. So I applied endlessly to multiple positions in the company. And it did take some time to get in the door. So to any of you all, looking to start applying to jobs and things like that, or to have that on the horizon, just know the journey's tough when you're applying to jobs. I got lucky with the government job, and even that was an inundating process to get in the door as far as the sort of hoops you have to jump through from a clearance standpoint and everything else. When you're talking about breaking into the commercial sector or the private sector, it's a totally different ballgame. It's just, a lot of it's who you know, and I can say networking is everything. I see your group on LinkedIn is very active, like Norberto reaching out to me, which was, an interesting connection to make. And it sounds like you all are kind of very active in the cyber community writ large. So, one thing I want to harp on is network like crazy. It pays dividends at the end of the day. Introduce yourself to as many people as you possibly can and get to know what they're doing. If it's a job that you're potentially interested in, or if they're in a role or in a company that you're interested in, just get to know more and more about, what those folks are doing. That's going to help you instrumentally in your journey and your career going forward. So I cannot harp on that enough.
What about your recommendations for how people would find this, though? We actually have a lot of new students who are actually very, very new into cybersecurity. I know Norberto actually placed a little bit on exactly what Dragos does, and I guess specifically on what your subject matter is. But let's say for students who, this is their first couple of days interacting in cybersecurity and they're just getting their feet wet. how would they learn more about this stuff in order to, I guess, start making those connections? Where are they finding these people to, I guess, to talk about this stuff, I know
Yeah,
like LinkedIn, but are we just connecting here? Are we going to conferences? Like, what would your preferred method be?
yeah, absolutely. So just starting out, my first recommendation is get your hands on any kind of reading material you possibly can. And when I say reading material, like look at CyberWire, look at the type of publications out there that are putting out content on cybersecurity and do research. And I mean, I don't know what types of courses you all are enrolled in right now, but I know from just my past experience, I was forced to write a ton of papers. So my bachelor's degree was very writing intensive because it was management and policy for cybersecurity. So I had to learn like all of the NIST standards front to back and a lot of the different other policies out there front to back. And that really kind of underpinned the additional experience I started to get. So from kind of if you're a newbie to cyber, just read like crazy. Even if you maybe don't like to read, try to read. And there's so many good resources out there as far as like video content. If you're just trying to learn more about, like, let's say you're interested in certifications or something of that nature, Udemy, great source for kind of cyber courses. Cybrary, also another great resource I've used myself. I mean, heck, even like YouTube and going to YouTube and looking for just, basic cybersecurity informative videos. I highly recommend just getting well read on the subject. Um, I'll say for me, I'm one of those people that, looking at something initially, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me until I actually start applying myself and doing something hands on. So even when I got my bachelor's, I was like, okay, so now what? Right. So then I get the job in the government, I start working, and I'm like, okay, things are starting to connect. I'm starting to see dots connect. I see how the policy part of cybersecurity is really playing a role in some of these like key efforts I'm working on. That's really neat. But I want to, take that one step further. And so me personally, when I went to kind of go more of a technical route, because again, I started out in just like that management and policy kind of broad view, I ended up going for a master's in cyber technology. And that really, really was a deep dive into much more specific technical instances of cybersecurity and really understanding what people who have hands on keyboard all day do. What does that look like from, that viewpoint? And I'll tell you that really, really opened my eyes, because there was a lot of things I started to work on where in my day to day, I was like, oh my gosh, I just took this course as part of my master's and now I'm doing this live at work and it all is connecting. It's all making sense. So read as much as you can, look at as many resources as you can. I'm very happy to, put together anything after this to send to you all. As far as recommendations for reading sources, I read a lot of white papers myself, just in cyber, and I just try to keep well read in the subject. It really helps.
We might not have some people who might not know what white papers are. Do you mind kind of expanding on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a white paper is typically, I mean, it can be anywhere from 4 to 6 pages. It can be up to 20 pages. But a white paper is generally, informative paper about a subject or topic in general. It can be about literally anything. So in the cyber community, there's a lot of reputable folks out there that write white papers, and a lot of organizations that support those white papers. So SANS, if anyone's familiar with SANS, that's SANS. That's SANS.org. If you go to SANS, you will find a handful of things as far as reading materials and presentations, even slideshows and on-demand learning that you can pull from their webinars that really, really help just kind of provide you with that baseline of information within cybersecurity and just getting an understanding of, what's this all about. Does that help?
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're fine. I'm more than
Yeah,
happy to answer
no,
any questions.
I was just showing the students the SANS posters we actually have as prizes today.
Oh, very cool. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, feel free to continue
Um,
now.
okay, great. One of the other questions that popped up, and I actually really like this question, asking about, as a woman in cybersecurity, are there any tips, suggestions, words of encouragement, um, especially for other women that might be unsure if this is for them? Um, my first kind of thing to say to that is don't give up. So I will say, especially in industrial cybersecurity, it's a very male dominated field. And it can be quite intimidating. And I guess myself, I never realized how male dominated it was until I got into the job I'm in and realized, oh, I'm one of two females in my immediate team. Like it's just two of us. And we're a full technical team, but there's only two females on the team. Um, so that was very interesting and enlightening to me, just because when I came from just broader cybersecurity in the government, focused more on the IT side of things, there are a lot of females in that field. It's very, I would say, balanced as far as female to male ratio. But when you start getting into industrial, it is historically just a male dominated field. I am starting to see a big shift in that, and more folks are getting interested in industrial and getting involved in industrial. So, biggest tip is, don't give up, and don't be intimidated. It's actually, super humbling to be able to come into industrial as, one of maybe, just a handful of females in that field, being able to apply myself and show that I can learn this, I can understand this, and really be able to kind of make a mark. Um, Another question on here, can you speak about some of the emerging threats and challenges faced by the industrial control system defense community? Any suggestions on how to address them? So I'll speak
I
on
might
one in yeah.
I might want to also elaborate a little bit on what the ICS defense community really is, because I think not a lot of people may actually have, I guess, a lot of knowledge specifically about industrial cybersecurity, as it's actually not something in our curriculum right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So industrial in itself is separate from your typical IT side of things. So when you hear something like ICS, that's industrial control system. When you hear the OT, when you hear that acronym, that's operational technology. Operational technology is basically the umbrella that industrial control systems sits under. And when you think of those two terminologies, it's really the power grid. So if you think of the power that comes into your home, your apartment, wherever you live, your campus, if you think of the water running through your sink, if you think of how food makes its way into the grocery stores that you buy at the store that you get delivered to you, if you think of how cars are manufactured, like all of these kind of key pivotal things to society that are created are really backbone by industrial cybersecurity. So that's exactly why I really love industrial, because it goes well beyond, your immediate computer system and looking at your typical information technology systems, or, just like a data center or something like that. This goes well beyond that. This is really talking about, systems that are linked to what we every day might take for granted, like the power and the water coming into our homes and everything like that. So when you hear industrial, that's really what that amounts to, and I'll get into a little more of that in the presentation. But at a high level, that's really what it breaks down to. As far as emerging threats and trends and the challenges we face in industrial, there is a slew of them, which I'll also get into. But I think the main one to answer that question, which also really affects IT, so it's one of those threats that affects both. But the type of challenges it presents to industrial are immensely different than what you would see on the IT side, which I'll also get into. Ransomware. I mean, you hear ransomware everywhere, anywhere. Ransomware is one of the top cyber threats and challenges out there. It continues to be a top threat, and that's not going away. And it can severely impact industrial systems because it can cause, loss of availability and downtime in those environments, which in industrial, that's a potential loss of safety, that's a potential loss of revenue. So when you're looking at industrial and ransomware's impact to industrial, again, that is kind of a huge pivotal threat that is out there that many people are well aware of and know can be very detrimental to their business. Whereas on the IT side, yes, it can cause the same amount of kind of downtime and lack of availability, but it won't necessarily cause the same loss of revenue that you would see in industrial. You'll see loss of revenue in IT if your systems have to go down for, let's say, weeks at a time because you're unable to get them back up due to ransomware. But when you look at something like industrial, the impact is just much heavier in that particular kind of segment of cybersecurity. So at a high level, that's kind of the top threat I would point to. And I encourage you to read up on that as well. And I can send a kind of list of resources on that topic. The next one was, how does threat intel relate to incident response, and what are some of the ways that you interact with or collaborate with fellow practitioners in incident response? So threat intel is actually the kind of backbone of incident response, as far as it really enables you to do kind of more proactive incident response and intel driven response. And I'll get into more of that in the actual presentation, but that's a really, really interesting question. I do want to kind of peel that back a bit more as we kind of continue on. What steps would you recommend to any of our students who might be interested in following your example and joining the ICS defense community? Yeah, absolutely. So if you all are interested in diving into industrial and learning more about industrial, to my point earlier on read, ton of resources when it comes to industrial that are out there. SANS is one of kind of the big proponents out there that puts out a ton of really reliable, really great resources when it comes to understanding industrial, understanding what's in industrial, what are the threats in industrial, and just getting kind of a full rounded picture of industrial. So that's easy enough to kind of get you guys up to speed on that. And I can definitely, again, pull together a handful of resources that I would recommend to you all. And there's a lot of folks out there in the community that talk about industrial, whether it be at Dragos or other organizations outside of Dragos. Industrial is a hot topic. I highly encourage you, I harp on LinkedIn all the time, and I continue to, because I think it's just such a valuable networking resource. But, look for other companies out there that do industrial and seek out other folks that are doing, talks or, talks at conferences and things like that. You'll take away so much information from those types of things.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Actually, speaking of Dragos a little bit, I know not a lot of students might be actually acquainted with specifically your company. If you want to go and talk a little bit more on, like, I guess in a broader view of exactly what Dragos does.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dragos itself, our kind of tagline is safeguarding civilization, which is kind of like a, tongue-in-cheek way of saying, again, back to my point of the water coming into your home, your power coming into your home. We truly, truly believe in having an impact to where we can protect people in their day-to-day lives when they're just, going about their day. So when it comes to our mission at Dragos, our goal is to arm these industrial asset owners and operators and business organizations with the tools and peace of mind necessary to ensure that at the end of the day, they know what assets are in their industrial environments. They know how to defend those assets, and they know what they're defending those assets against as far as the threats. So really having full-blown visibility, detection, and response across their entire industrial ecosystem. And we offer, just as a company, a variety of ways of doing that, right? So if you all are familiar with different tools that are out there on the market from a vendor perspective, continuous monitoring solutions. So if you think of on the IT side, the kind of exchange I say is on the IT side, you have your intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems and those types of tools that you would add for kind of that defense in depth strategy per se. If you look at the OT side of things, you would have something like a continuous monitoring solution. Ideally, it would be passive. So, one of the things that we preach and that I firmly believe in myself is in industrial, you do not want a kind of active endpoint solution going out and touching your assets, because at the end of the day, that could cause some sort of disruption in an industrial environment. And that is not good for an industrial environment. So again, going back to the differences between kind of that IT and OT space, OT is much more complex and sensitive when it comes to changes in the environment, when it comes to introducing new technologies into the environment. A lot of the systems in OT are literally ancient, older than most of us in this room. All of that said, you don't want to be kind of touching those types of assets in the environment.
That makes sense. Before I know you start on the rest of your presentation, does anybody else have any questions about specifically Dragos, about Liz, about getting into your cybersecurity career? So I know we've been talking about it for a bit. If you just want to agree, what's up?
What inspired her to be into this field?
Oh, so we had somebody ask, what inspired you to get into this field? I know we
Yeah,
talked a little
absolutely.
bit about it earlier because I know you came a little late, but
Yeah, so for me, once I kind of got almost desensitized to the sort of repetitive incident response across the IT space, and it was literally getting to a point where almost every day I woke up and it was like, oh, it's another incident. And it went from this excitement factor of, yes, I get to go, help with another incident response to, yeah, it's another incident and it's the same issue, same reason why we have an incident. Whereas I saw kind of critical infrastructure and being an industrial as something new, exciting, more of a challenge, more complex. And it was something that I would write about frequently in a lot of my kind of college papers through my bachelor's and master's programs, where I always had an interest. I just never knew how am I going to get there. And then that's how I kind of just said, I'm going to take the leap and I'm going to do something in an industrial.
so yeah, it looks like we're pretty good then to go and start with the presentation. I'm especially interested in the demo that you have prepared for us, and because I know those are pretty cool security tools that Dragos releases.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, kind of diving into the differences of IT and OT, and I know we kind of scratched the surface initially, but the differences between IT and OT. So when you look at IT, information technology, you're looking at things like your typical servers, your laptops, your iPhones, cameras, point of sale devices, even like when you go to a store and check out at a store. When you look at OT, operational technology, which again is all things kind of industrial in that nature, you're looking at things like PLCs, which are known as programmable logic controls. You're looking at remote terminal units, RTUs. You're looking at interfaces such as HMIs, and you're looking at things like sensors and valves. And those sensors and valves could be doing things like, oh, I'm managing the temperature on this particular set of controls, or I'm controlling, the water level in a tank for a waste management or nuclear facility or something of that nature. So again, two different kind of sides of the spectrum here. And then going from kind of the system types into how you manage vulnerabilities in these environments, and again getting into those differences. So in your typical IT environment, you have a vulnerability, you immediately want to patch that so that you don't have a reason for an adversary to come pick on you and get into your systems by exploiting that vulnerability. So you're always trying to make sure you're staying up to date on the latest software, latest patches. Whereas in industrial, it's a totally different playing field. The kind of way you patch and way you prioritize patching is entirely different, because again, we're talking about introducing risk into your environment when looking at things in industrial. So if you were to patch, you may accidentally knock something down off the network in industrial if you patch. So those are all things that need to kind of be top of mind when you're looking at, well, in industrial, how do I actually say I should or shouldn't patch something? Or when do I say this isn't the right time to patch? Or is there an alternative solution or mitigation? So all those things have to be considered there. And then looking at the actual network traffic that traverses IT versus OT. When you're looking at IT, your typical, HTTPS sessions, DNS, RTP, even if you look at things like MP4 video, all typical kind of IT traffic there. Then when you kind of go over to the OT side, it's sort of like a foreign language for a lot of folks not exposed to industrial, but there are a ton of industrial protocols that traverse the OT network. So you have things like Modbus, you have things like SIP, which is a very common industrial protocol. You have things like Foxborough Comex. You have things like just a handful of protocols out there, and the list is just extremely long. But the network traffic on both sides is just completely different there. And then when you look at how you manage incidents in these environments, when you look at IT, yes, you have a loss of data, you could have a loss of intellectual property and network services. But on the OT side, you are talking about things like I could have a loss of the actual electrical grid. And that's kind of the impact we're talking about here, the pipeline. So if you think of what happened back in, it was 2020 or 2019, if anyone's familiar with the Colonial Pipeline incident, they actually got hit with ransomware, but it ended up being their IT business systems, not their OT business systems. However, had they not shut down their IT business systems, there could have potentially been, if that IT system was touching their industrial environment, a way for an adversary to get into their industrial environment and cause very severe damage, disruption, and loss of availability or control. So all those things considered, and again, kind of hitting back on the ransomware threat example, when you're looking at industrial, there's a lot more at stake than what you see on the typical IT side of things. And I'll also be able to show you a kind of a handful of some of the industrial protocols you might see in the demo environment as well. So let's take that back kind of one more layer. You hear all these other terminologies kind of thrown around out there. If you've done some reading, Internet of Things, IoT, Industrial Internet of Things, which is IIoT, and then you have us in operational technology. So when you think of IoT, that's going to be your Alexa, your Google Home, your CCTV cameras and things of that nature, the security cameras on the outside of a building, your Ring camera. All those things are going to fall into the bin of IoT. And then when you look at things like industrial IoT, those are going to be kind of these more connected sensors and automated sensors and tracking devices, things you might see, let's say, at like an Amazon hub that's managing, packages going in and out of the building for fulfilling orders and things of that nature as an example. And again, that's industrial Internet of Things, IIoT. And those are things found in OT. And then if you look at, again, OT, you have your programmable logic controls, HMIs, distributed control systems, which is DCS. You have your remote terminal units, which are RTUs. And all of those particular devices are controllers that are controlling pipelines and factories and the electrical grid and water systems and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. So when kind of looking across these three key areas, that's where you sort of see the sort of vast differences here. And again, back to what's really at stake when it comes to operational technology versus things that err more towards the side of IT, like the Internet of Things. So jumping right from kind of the differences in OT, IT, IoT, IIoT, instant response. Instant response is very reactive in nature. What you're looking at when you do instant response is you're going to be leveraging adversary TTPs being tactics, techniques, procedures, the known behaviors of an adversary or threat group, indicators of compromise, IOCs, and other intelligence artifacts to perform incident response. So generally, you're in an environment, you're collecting artifacts, you're using those artifacts to further what you're trying to look for and what you're trying to resolve at the end of the day. And I put on the screen, if you all are familiar with it, but the NIST framework. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So at some point you're always in this loop somewhere, and I always say to folks and preach, everybody wants to be in that space where they're protecting and able to detect on malicious or nefarious activity. Nobody ever wants to be kind of caught blindsided and having to perform incident response. It sounds all fun and games, but it's really not, because the victim that's affected by that incident is having to deal with a lot more than just, hey, I have an incident. It comes down to, back to my point in industrial and even IT, some loss of revenue, and in some cases some more than others, or not having your business up and running the way that it should, or having to come up with a backup site where you're doing work from for some X amount of time until you can resolve the incident. Stakes are pretty high when it comes to incident response. And ultimately, the goal when you are in kind of an incident response environment doing incident response, is really being able to reduce the dwell time in the environment so that you can get to a point where you can remediate as quickly as possible and mitigate and move forward. And then we get to the other side of things where we talk about threat hunting. So a lot of folks, I think, miss the two differences here between kind of incident response and threat hunting. You can have a threat hunter that performs threat hunting, and they can perform incident response. Threat hunting is proactive in nature. So a threat hunter actually is performing active defense, where they are performing hypothesis-driven threat hunting in environments. So they're either going to take intel and say, I'm going to go into this environment or this network or wherever, and I'm going to use intelligence to say, I think this is happening, so I'm going to look for this thing and see if I can find anything from that. They could also say, I'm going into this environment because I have situational awareness on sort of ransomware, as an example, as a kind of key or major threat. And, I'm going to use that as part of a hypothesis for going in and threat hunting, based on the fact that, I know ransomware is a hot threat. This is what I know about this environment. So that's what I'm going to use as part of my hypothesis. And then you have domain expertise. So maybe a particular sector that's constantly targeted, or industry segment. So just as an example, the financial sector that's hit constantly, or even the healthcare sector that's hit constantly. If you have domain expertise as a threat hunter in those areas and really understand those threats that target those sectors, you may say, all right, knowing all of what I know, I'm going to pick on a few different things that I know typically an adversary uses to potentially try to exploit these environments and get into these environments. And I'm going to go perform a proactive threat hunt as a result of that. So big difference here is really IOCs versus TTPs. And I kind of spelled this out earlier, but for anyone new to, again, cyber, indicators of compromise, and this will come up all of the time in cyber, so just be aware and write that down. And then tactics, techniques, procedures. So when you look at these kind of two sides of the spectrum, IOCs are typically very easy to leverage. Indicators of compromise are typically things like IPs, file hashes, domains, whereas your tactics, techniques, procedures come down to a unique adversary's behaviors, what they're actually doing, If you look at things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework for IT or for ICS, or the cyber kill chain for IT or ICS, those really break down what a adversary is using as far as TTPs go. And that's, again, looking at how difficult a kind of threat hunt could be based on either one of those criteria and what you're using. And then kind of dovetailing that right into a talk track on cyber threat intelligence. Is anyone here familiar with the diamond model intrusion analysis? Just raise your hand if you are, I'm curious. Anybody? No? Okay, so diamond model for intrusion analysis is this graphic here at the right side of the screen at the bottom. This is what folks will typically use from an intel perspective to understand what an adversary's capabilities are, what their infrastructure looks like, who they typically target as far as victimology. Once you've filled in all kind of points here of this diamond, that's when you've basically said this is a threat actor or a threat group. So intelligence teams typically use this model to do exactly that, to say, hey, this is a threat group you should be aware of, and this is what they do, and this is why they do it, and this is how they do it. So kind of going to the five W's, the who, what, why, where, when, how, that's really what that amounts to when you're looking at the diamond model for intrusion analysis. And all good threat intelligence is going to have an answer to what is a threat, what is the impact, and what action am I going to take. Intelligence does you no good if they just say, hey, you have this bad thing that could cause some sort of damage or this or that to your environment without any sort of fix, right? Any mitigation or remediation. So again, all good threat intelligence should have threat, impact, and action. Then briefly looking at the threat intelligence life cycle. So threat intelligence follows this cycle when it comes to producing threat intelligence and then enriching your threat intelligence. So this is the framework here. You have planning and direction, collection, processing, analysis, dissemination, and feedback. What's really...
Can you hear me? Okay, we're having technical difficulties in the class. If we can just pause for a second so we can, our president's asking if you can go back like a slide or two. I think we're getting it. We lost. You were describing.
I'm getting some feedback. It's not coming through entirely.
Yeah. Hey, let's.
It's hard to hear you guys. It just keeps bouncing the sound.
Hello?
Yep.
I think on the chat, Oda said that you can start off on the diamond model of intrusion analysis.
Okay.
But I don't know if they're ready yet, though.
Oh,
Sorry about that. We should be okay on our side now.
Oh, okay.
You're more than welcome to continue. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, just reiterating, I guess, back on the diamond model for intrusion analysis. This is typically used by cyber threat intel analysts to map out essentially a threat group or an adversary that they're tracking. And once the kind of 4 points of the diamond are completely filled out based on knowing what the adversary does, their infrastructure they're using, their victimology, so who they're targeting, and ultimately their capabilities and the types of TTPs that they're using. Once that's filled out, that's essentially saying, here's a threat group that's a reasonable threat group that we're tracking. Example I like to point to, if you're not really kind of familiar with threat groups or understanding different adversaries that are out there, I always point folks to the IT side first, just because it's a good kind of foundational set of knowledge to have. If you go to, let's say, FireEye's website or even Mandiant's website, you should be able to pull down a threat group report or adversary report or something called, APT, insert a number, because that's how they're tracked on the IT side as far as the threat groups go. And what you'll be able to do is pull down those profiles and really start to dig into and learn exactly what these groups are doing out in the IT space. When you hear about an incident and someone says, oh, we thought it was APT XYZ, insert your number, you can then go to those reports and say, okay, now I understand sort of the background on threat groups and what they're doing and sort of their motives and intents in the space. So again, cyber threat intelligence is really underpinning things like threat hunting and incident response, and it's really sort of a good feedback mechanism into those things and enriching the intelligence you get when you perform a threat hunt or an incident response. And all good threat intel, like I said earlier, should have the threat, the impact, and the action. So if you have threat intelligence, you should be able to use it to either mitigate or remediate from a incident or whatever's going on in the environment. Then taking a look at sort of the threat intel life cycle here. This is important just from the perspective of if you are doing a threat hunt or an incident response, you're generally going to want to feed any sort of new intel, new information you're learning from that incident response or from that threat hunt back into your collection source, collection being here. So if you're a incident response team or a threat hunter team, you generally are going to be reaching back into your organization to, let's say, a analyst or a group of analysts who have a collection source of some sort where they're constantly putting out intelligence to feed what you're doing out in the field. As a result of what you're doing out in the field, you're going to feed them information back, and that's going to further enrich the data that you're gathering. So it really, really, really makes a huge difference in kind of the quality of your incident response and your threat hunting, and just overall makes things more effective and efficient in that space. And then just from the idea of how do we get from point A to point B when we're doing a threat hunt or incident response. As an organization, it typically stems from that organization's priority intel requirements. Priority intel requirements are sort of the broad strategic strokes of, I want to understand what exploitive vulnerabilities can my organization defend against. And as part of that priority intel requirement, you're able to break that into sort of these smaller key intel questions, which are these. And those key intel questions can be strategic, tactical, operational, or technical in nature. And those are all feeding different teams. So if you look at something like tactical, this feeds right back into that kind of threat hunting or incident response concept. So if you have a key intel question stemming from that broader priority intel requirement, you'll be able to dive into specifically the tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs, the how, and then that will inform where you actually look on a threat hunt. So the kind of key takeaway here when it comes to sort of this whole intel cycle and your priority intel requirements and key intel questions is that's all going to feed the mission further when you're doing a threat hunt or an incident response. And then briefly touching on threat intelligence automation. So with threat intelligence, you could be getting threat intelligence from half a dozen different sources, which I would hope so. You should never, rely on one single source for threat intelligence. The more the merrier. But the quality of those sources should be really good quality. The more you can rely on data from first party sources, the better, because that's going to be more accurate and really going to help whatever you're doing on the sort of threat hunt or incident response side of things. And as part of that, you're going to want to say, okay, well, if I have all of these data feeds I'm getting intelligence from, how am I going to correlate across all of those data feeds? And that's where you really get into things like automation. So again, this goes back to sort of the broader concept on performing incident response or threat hunting and being able to look across multiple data sets in a way where you're not inundating the threat hunter or analyst who's trying to perform any type of analysis when they have boots on the ground in an environment or in a network. So the idea here is to leverage tool sets that will do that automation for you, or you're leveraging something like an API that can pull in indicators of compromise into one single data lake, if you will, so that you can look across that data all at once without having to sort of look at all of them stovepiped in their own sort of vessels, if that makes sense.
So I'm curious for specifically Dragos. I know there's a lot of like different kind of like what is I guess threat hunting automation tools, but I'm actually kind of curious like where you're getting it. Like, is it from a company? Is it from like, is it made internally? Like, does Dragos host it like in house, or like where's this automation coming from?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The threat intelligence itself, and again, this depends on who you're talking to in the space, right? Threat intelligence itself should be majority first party threat intelligence. So your own in-house curated threat intelligence. You're not going out and saying, oh, I read all these blog posts and I read some intel from here and there and I copy and pasted that and I made a report and that's intelligence. That's not good intelligence. That's not quality intelligence. That really comes down to first party, second party, third party intelligence. So from the Dragos perspective, we try and err more on the side of first party threat intelligence, delivering quality intelligence to the community, to our customers. When it comes to the automation bit, that really actually is going to drive more towards the actual customer themselves, because they could be using our equipment in their environment, our tools, and then they could be using several other tools. So they would probably look to lean on a vendor that specifically focuses on aggregating data, such as configuration management database, CMDB. Those are very popular in the IT and OT space because those are going to pull in multiple data sets, multiple feeds, and that really comes down to having the relationships across the industry to say, oh, I'm so and so, and I work with Dragos and this person and this person and this person, and I have integrations built out with my tools so that you as a client of mine can actually use my tool with all these other tools and be able to view everything in a single pane of glass. So that's really where kind of the automation pays off. Us in Dragos ourselves, we're not putting out a like threat intelligence automation tool. That's not, we're focused in industrial. So that would be, again, where you lean on somebody else in the industry and you're using multiple tool sets, which is very common.
So I know that someone in the chat, actually, I believe it was Jose, who actually was very interested in like more the government side. What about more sensitive clients, like specifically the US government, where it might be a little bit more difficult than say your average company to, I guess, get this sense of intelligence and like working with their platforms, because they are especially sensitive, they go down, but they're also extremely hard to get, possibly some intelligence in terms of what could possibly cause problems for it, or, things in that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing about the government, right? They're very intel driven and intel focused. So the government has some of the best intel sources in the entire world. That's just kind of their bread and butter and their nature. And they're getting that data from multiple, to your point, sensitive kind of sources and things based on missions that they've been given from, mandates and their authorities and regulations. as far as the tools that they use, it's not to say a government client won't use a commercial tool, but they generally will use more of their own tools than commercial tools. And that's where you really get into, it's called government off the shelf, GOTS, versus commercial off the shelf, COTS. So commercial off the shelf tools are everything that you can see out in the open today. So when you look at Dragos, when you look at a FireEye, a Mandiant, a CrowdStrike, a Microsoft, you name it, those are all commercial off the shelf tools. The things you don't see and won't ever know about unless you're in the government, because to your point, the sensitive nature of those things are government off the shelf tools. So tools that they build specifically in-house to further their mission. And because they maybe don't want to take a risk on something, to your point, out there that's open to anybody and everybody to go buy and purchase, that could be taken down, like a SolarWinds, like a Pulse Secure VPN. So all of these different things that have happened over the course of the past, few years, even as far as cyber threats and incident response, has really, really shown, why there can be so many kind of vulnerabilities and security issues when looking at tools out in the commercial space, unfortunately. Did that answer the question?
Yes, sorry, I was running around.
I also see, I'm just looking at the chat now, I see a question about, would national critical infrastructures be considered part of ICS, from Jose? Yes. So if you look at Jose CISA's website, and I can send it to you if you're not familiar with them, they cover, based on their authorities in the government, they cover 16 critical infrastructures. And that's all 16 critical infrastructures. So that's transportation, that's everything. We cover at Dragos 11 of those 16. So we cover oil and gas, electric, food and beverage, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, building automation systems. We cover the government space, and we cover 3 or 4 other ones that I can't name off the top of my head, transportation being one of them. And there's just so much out there. So to your point on sort of the national critical infrastructure, there is so much critical infrastructure out there. If you look at, this is super interesting to me, if you look at things like HVAC, so like your heating, cooling, if you look at like a fire suppression system that makes it so that the sprinkler alarm will go off if you have a fire, those are all tied to industrial control systems. So that all has kind of an industrial backbone to it. So all of that's just very interesting as far as the full coverage as national critical infrastructure goes. And then kind of closing out the sort of talk track on intelligence is looking at indicators and what indicators are currently out there. So you have a variety of indicators, and I think Norberto mentioned that he had folks take a look at this because I had given him sort of homework or ideas for you all, but this is called the pyramid of pain. The pyramid of pain is really meant to show you the kind of challenges you stumble upon when you're looking at different indicators of compromise. So going beyond, your easy sort of trivial things like hash values, IP addresses, domains, and getting into things that are just a bit more challenging and difficult to get off of a network when it comes to network host artifacts, certain tools, and then understanding TTPs, tactics, techniques, procedures. So this is the pyramid of pain. If you're not familiar with it, highly recommend looking it up. I will send you a article on it if you all are interested after, just because it really helps to start to lay out, if you are an incident responder, if you are a threat hunter, if you're trying to gather forensic evidence this is ultimately, in that role, what you're dealing with on a day to day, and you become very familiar with sort of the ins and outs of this. And then pop quiz with Liz. So I wanted to try and make this a little interactive before I jumped into the demonstration. And hopefully you all are ready to answer questions.
I got a question. How many pop quiz questions are there?
4.
4. 1 off. Okay. Huh? Oh, you have more? How many? 3 more. Liz, would you mind doing us a favor and maybe would a number of 6 be nice questions? We may or may not have some Sans posters to give out. Might be fun.
Yeah, I can definitely I can try and come up with 6.
Yeah, because I think you have 4 right now. We'll see. We'll see. Just go and make it a little fun. Yeah, let's see the first one.
All right. So, what is the biggest difference between IT and OT?
Anybody have any ideas? Those who are over Zoom are also able to participate too. But you will have to go and speak up. I will not be taking the chat.
Jenny got my sound.
Okay, what's up? What's the difference between OT environments and what was it? Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so my stab at that question would be IT environments or environments that hold the information on them and that you can act on, and OT is what acts on those environments.
What do you think, Liz?
The name is operations.
Mm-hmm. In
So
English?
which one was that? Because I gave you 4 choices.
Yeah.
Oh.
In English?
I
know you're really smart, Matt, but come on,
that was a good answer. Like I do like that answer, but I gave you 4 choices here.
Then choice 3 would it be choice 3?
Number 3?
Yes. Oh. Yep, that is correct. That is correct. So that is the biggest difference between IT and OT, where again, like I harped on earlier, the kind of detriment and impact to OT is a lot worse than IT. So nobody wants a loss of downtime or any sort of safety issues. So good job.
Okay. So Matt, looks like we owe you a Sans poster.
Yay. Thank you.
Yeah. Someone else also said it was number 3, so yeah, pretty cool too. Yeah. What was it? 3 for this one? Is it 3?
So the question is, what is the difference between threat hunting and incident response? And we got 3. Yep, we got a 3. Correct.
And then actually, Liz, let's do 5 instead because somebody actually did also answer over here. So we got 3 more.
Okay, and then so this is actually the last one I had. I thought I had 4, but I can try and come up with something. So rank the following IOCs from the easiest to collect to the most difficult to collect.
Okay, someone has it over here. They said hashes.
So this is ranking them. So I don't know if you want to make this into like a multi thing. So you have to rank them from easiest to most difficult. So there's 6 here. And I showed you something earlier called the pyramid of pain. I know I showed it briefly, but
yeah. How about let's do 2 categories per person. So who can name the first 2 categories? What's up? From bottom and top. You had it earlier. Huh? Okay, so hashes first. And then what's above the hashes? Okay, so that's the first two. So is that correct? Is it hashes and the domains?
Hashes was correct. Domains is not.
Okay.
So you got the first one.
Yeah. Any other takers? It's hashes and something. What up, James? It's hashes and IP? Is it? Yes. Okay. Congrats, James. Okay, so who could think of the next two after that? Yeah, if you want to participate, you have to get off mute. I'm not taking chats.
Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, sorry, y'all. But
I got the next
yeah.
two. It would be number 2. Oh, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Eric. What's up?
Okay, so it'll be 2 domains and then 5 network and host-based artifacts.
Yes.
For the next 2.
Correct.
Okay. So next time you come to the FAST meeting, we'll get you a SANS poster. We owe you one.
Okay, thank you.
And then what's the next two after that? Any takers? What's up, Jovan? Jovan? Huh? Okay, so then okay, which one is it? Okay, tools and then TTPs for the next one. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, congrats. You got a SANS poster.
So does that cover everything on the SANS posters? Or do we have any more left?
Does. No, it looks
Okay.
like we got rid of the SANS posters. Yeah, good job, y'all. Good job also, Keenan, for putting together. Also, I think Nathan also posted it too. Sorry, y'all, about the chat, but shout out to them.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly switch gears into
The
our demo. Yes, correct.
And this demo wasn't supposed to be like free or anything, so we weren't able to get it, right? If not, I can get people to download it.
No, this isn't
Yeah.
something you can download.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
But what I'm hoping this will at least show you is sort of, the idea behind this is to show you what industrial looks like and what the types of tools you would use in industrial look like. And again, this isn't sort of a, every single tool looks like this or anything like that. This is really just giving you an idea of one tool that's out there on the market. So to that point, like highly encourage you all, like as you're networking, as you do kind of these workshop events, reach out to other folks in other companies and see if they're willing to do things like this, because it just really, really helps sort of inform your overall kind of view of what's out there. And it's just interesting.
Yeah, so not all of us are business majors and not all of us are computer science majors. So I think probably the best way to go about it would probably be to also go through examples. If that makes sense, like say I own XYZ, this is why it looks like this. In a typical company, it'll look like this number. I think probably just because a lot of us don't own companies of ourselves.
Yeah, so first to give you an idea, this is a passive monitoring solution. Okay, so that's what the tool is. Again, when you look at IT, you would use something like an intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system. You don't have those on the OT side. Again, you don't want anything doing any sort of active capability. You don't want downtime in the environment. So the goal of this tool here that I'm showing you is in a customer's environment that we would deploy into, whether it be someone who works in the electric industry, someone who owns, an oil and gas rig, someone who owns a manufacturing operation, all of those things at play. This is the tool that gets deployed into their environment. And as a result of deploying this tool, what would happen is you start to see what is in their environment. And one of the key challenges with OT is a lot of the times we hear folks say, I honestly don't know what's in my industrial environment. And that's not to say you don't ever hear on the IT side, folks say, I don't know what IT assets I have, devices on my network, because I've also heard that before, granted, but you hear it much more often on the OT side. We've even had folks say, wow, I've been at this company for 10 years, working, let's say electric as an example, and I didn't know I had that asset on my network that whole time. So lots of red flags there. Goal of this tool, provide you that visibility, is one of the things that it does. So using this tool, you get an idea of what's in your environment. This is called a dashboard. So this is just a visualization that can be used to enable you to leverage the tool further to come up with things like reports and alerts that you can send to your leadership. So again, this is me talking from a, hey, this is our tool, and this is what a customer would use in their environment, this tool, if they were to buy it. Assets. So I just talked about having visibility in your environment. So interestingly enough, when you go into an OT environment, you will see IT assets. There's no doubt about that. There's this thing called IT and OT convergence, and it's not really in a convergent state anymore. It's sort of converged now. And what that means is when you go into an industrial environment, you're likely going to see a ton of IT assets just because we're in this age of digital transformation where technology is constantly evolving. So even though you have all these kind of ancient devices I mentioned on the OT side, you also have younger folks and folks that want to kind of progress technology forward, moving IT assets into that industrial environment. So you're seeing both of those things together, which is not a shock at all. That's, kind of par for the course at this point. So you may see some Windows devices in an OT network, but the main thing you're looking at in an OT network are the industrial devices outside of your immediate Windows devices. And industrial devices may look something like this. So this device, don't have a picture, sorry. They don't show pictures here, but you'll see this device is a motor control device. It's actually under an actuator. So one of those kind of sensor types I talked about earlier, whether that means it's, in an environment, making sure the temperature doesn't get too hot or too cold. That's what that boils down to. So we're looking at this actuator motor control device. And again, this is an industrial device purely. The vendor here is a Rockwell automation device. So that's the vendor. When you start, if any of you all find that industrial is super interesting to you and you start reading up on it, there are a ton of vendors in the space for industrial that are kind of unique names that you may not be familiar with or may not have heard of before. Highly recommend, go check them out. Things like Rockwell, things like Siemens, things like Yokogawa, Johnson Controls. If any of those ring a bell for you at all or sound at all familiar, go look them up. Those are industrial vendors. So they're the ones selling these industrial devices that go into these different environments that I've mentioned. This environment we're looking at is actually a mock manufacturing environment. So this is just mock data here to simulate what it would look like if you go into a manufacturing environment. So the first kind of key thing in industrial is getting that visibility into the environment, understanding the assets that are in the environment and talking to each other and what those devices look like. The next big thing is, okay, now I know what devices I have in my environment. How do I detect if I have a threat? How do I do a proactive threat hunt in my environment, or how do I perform an incident response? And that's where things get really interesting. So from an intelligence perspective, we have intelligence that actually gets basically injected into this tool from our other teams that perform intel analysis in industrial. And as a result of that information that gets pumped into here, in the form of basically like think of it as like a software update for this platform. In the form of those updates, you get kind of the latest, greatest, up-to-date indicators of compromise, any new updates coming into the platform on a sort of regular basis, right? It's not automated. You have to actually initiate the download because, again, we're talking about industrial, not, IT. So trying to be safe and secure as possible and limit any sort of access vectors that an adversary could try and penetrate to get into a system and that sort of thing. But what you'll see from here is, okay, I know this is a motor control device. What are the threats going on with this device? So that's where you start digging into, okay, I'm getting these notifications across this device. And I'm seeing that I have a few indicators that are firing that show this Trojan PowerShell in the environment. I may want to look into that further. Taking it one step further and saying, okay, these are the threats I'm seeing. Well, these are also the vulnerabilities I'm seeing in the environment. So in this particular case, this vulnerability is actually impacting this particular device. So you're getting a single pane of glass view where you're understanding here are the threats that are going across this particular device in the environment. Here is the vulnerability that's impacting this particular device. And you're able to effectively do something with that information. So if we take one step backwards, so that I don't kind of confuse anyone or conflate the terminology here, when you look at the notifications in the environment, you'll see that there's a total of 74 here. So we're just getting a brief preview here of those notifications. If I want to look at all of the notifications, I can pop that window open further. And this is just, again, showing you like kind of feature functionality of a tool, but also the premise behind some of these things. You actually see that we're filtered on that asset we were just looking at, that Rockwell device. If I took that away right now, I'd be seeing all of the notifications across the environment. And so I'm actually going to do that so I can give you an idea of all the notifications across the environment. So as a result of that, I'm pulling up everything. This is every single threat that's in this environment right now. And again, this is mock data. This isn't real data, but this is really to show you, this is what this looks like. So if I start looking at these notifications, I see I have a high severity on a lot of these. So the severity here is going from 0 to 5, 5 being most critical. If I were, let's say, putting my threat hunter hat on, and this is what I oftentimes tell to kind of folks I talk to in industrial, how would I tackle this sort of problem I'm seeing? I know what I have in my environment. Now I know I have all these threats in the environment because this is essentially where I'm seeing the sort of threats emerge. Now what do I do? Well, the first thing you want to do is kind of prioritize. So that's exactly what we've done here. We're looking at everything that's most critical at the top from least critical to the bottom. So we're sorting based on that criteria.
Well,
And
how worried would somebody actually be about these amount of severities? Like, if I was an incident responder right now, how upset should I be to see that these many 5s?
I think it depends, right? So it depends on what's actually going on in the environment. I would say, you should be on high alert if you're seeing anything that's greater than a 3 in your environment. Anything that's greater than a 3 in this environment is going to require an incident response.
So I'm not going to get any sleep tonight if I'm looking at like a screen like this.
Exactly.
Okay, so I guess we're not getting sleep, y'all.
Yeah. So and that's kind of like the premise, right? So in industrial, it's much more difficult to get your arms around sort of the threats that you're facing. And, there's no telling when you're going to have, a handful of these detections populate and say, yeah, you're facing something pretty serious right now. So in this particular manufacturing environment, we're seeing, there's, a handful of really high severity items. And now we need to figure out what we do with those. Because at a quick glance, you're like, okay, I see file downloads. That's not a good thing in an industrial environment. I'm seeing a program download. That's definitely not good. I see this is actually really bad, a asset where we see an actual status change on the asset. And so it's a control logic change on the actual asset where the key state is changing. So imagine an adversary actually going in and saying, yeah, I'm going to turn your nuclear power plant like all the way up to as hot as it can go so that you can't do anything about it. And I'm doing it as an adversary on your network and industrial, and your nuclear power plant blows up. Like that's the type of kind of severity of things that we're talking about when you put those sort of things into context. You're not talking about, hey, I hacked your computer on the IT side and you can't get in, or haha, I put a funny message on your laptop. This is, again, well beyond kind of the IT side of threats that you normally see, which is, again, to the point of why I say this is just a very interesting space to play in and be in. But if we want to take this one step further and say, okay, what are all these notifications meaning to me at the end of the day? I actually have the ability to come in here and say, okay, let me see what's happening, right? So I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, but MITRE ATT&CK mapping for IT and ICS, so there's two. And the ICS cyber kill chain, there's also the IT cyber kill chain. So we're looking specifically at the frameworks for ICS when it comes to tactics, techniques, procedures. And that's where you see the MITRE ATT&CK mapping actually mapped out for you right here based on the industrial tactic and technique. So you're seeing lateral movement in the network. So this is literally taking out all of the, as a tool in the marketplace, this is taking out all of that kind of heavy legwork that you would do as a forensic incident response analyst. If you're in a network, you're the one that's basically saying, okay, I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that, this is what I think I'm seeing. You're collecting all these artifacts. The tool is already doing that for you right now. So again, like it takes out a lot of that time spent going through and collecting those artifacts and says, here are the artifacts. Now you as the incident responder have everything you need to go figure out what to do next. So again, reducing that dwell time that it would take to get to a resolution. So maybe not up all night. So I may take that back, and maybe not up all night since you are reducing that dwell time. But we're seeing lateral movement in the network. We're also seeing exploitation of remote services in the network.
Could you actually elaborate more on the MITRE ATT&CK stuff? Because I know you just hit it, but if you want to actually like kind of explain a little bit to cyber kill chain and to MITRE for those who don't know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to pull it up for you guys. So
yeah, because I just learned about MITRE actually a couple of weeks ago, and wow, just wow, is that a really, really cool vulnerability?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I saw a talk on CactusCon about it, about another agency that was using it, and like they said how they appropriated it for their own company after adding a bunch of other stuff. And man, I want to go and see that so badly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just have to look how it works.
Yeah, so you can actually go to MITRE's website and you can pull down the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So they have it for IT and for ICS. There are differences between the two. It's like sort of subtle differences and depends on, is dependent on the environment. But highly recommend you go look them up, because what you can essentially do is come into here and learn a bit more about, you know, if you are a threat hunter and you are seeing lateral movement in the network. So if we go and we start looking and see lateral movement in the network and we're seeing exploitation of remote services, we can actually dig into that further. And this is just what we were seeing on our side on the tool. And we can say, okay, here are examples of that. And this is the IT framework, but it's very similar again. You're just going to see all the threats that we typically see on the IT side and what those typically amount to when you get notified that there's exploitation of remote services. You know, what are the threat groups that typically do that, and what are they doing when they do that? And so those are examples of that there. And yeah, this is actually, you know, good point, like super helpful to come in here and be able to kind of navigate across those, and highly recommend digging into that further. So if you guys do anything in the future in your workshops, as far as kind of a hands-on component, this would be kind of a good kind of reference to leverage for something like that if you were to walk through an exercise. But yeah, so kind of toggling back to the tool, lateral movement, we have exploitation of remote services. Now the ICS cyber kill chain steps, so let me just show you what that looks like. So as I mentioned earlier, white papers are everything. There is a ICS cyber kill chain white paper here on SAN's website that you guys can download for free and grab. I actually have a copy, I think, on my laptop. And this one is a good one. Actually, our CEO actually helped write this paper. But the ICS kill chain is slightly different than the IT kill chain. There's two steps to the kill chain, and basically your stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2 being very bad. If you see stage 2 as far as, hey, you have an ICS cyber kill chain and it's mapped to stage 2, which means it's in the delivery phase of the attack, you're in the midst of a major attack. So something to keep in mind there. But good reference, good white paper to download. A lot of good information in here about, the different phases, what that looks like. I was going to see if it shows the actual diagram in here. This is actually a good reference for you all. So the Purdue reference model, has anyone ever heard of that before? Any yeses in the room or in Zoom? Purdue model?
Unfortunately not. Actually, for me,
Okay.
honestly, I haven't even seen it actually before. The only thing that I really know is I guess the Lockheed Martin cyber chain, but yeah, nothing like this.
Like OSI model and the TCP IP stack?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so this is actually the equivalent for industrial. So if you think of the TCP IP stack and OSI models, where you're looking at, the data link layer, the application layer, presentation layer, and, all those great things, this is actually the equivalent here for OT. So OT has its own reference model, believe it or not, for, where things would appear in the network. And that's known as the Purdue reference model. Some folks say there's 4 levels, other folks say there's 5 levels. So, some say 4 or 5. But what it amounts to is essentially layers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 5. And 4 and 5 are typically where your IT network is meeting your industrial network. So when I mentioned you're going to see typically in the environment, your Windows assets and industrial, because we're in this time of, digital transformation and everything's converged. That's where you're going to actually see those assets within your industrial environment from an architectural standpoint. Your industrial DMZ is going to be just below that. And then you're going to have your actual manufacturing line of work, or your oil and gas, or your electric, or you name it. And that's going to basically fall within like level 3, kind of dipping into level 2. Level 2 is really where you're going to start to see your different control devices. So when I talked about programmable logic controls, remote terminal units, those control devices, distributed control devices, are going to appear in level 2. And then as you get lower and lower and lower, you start getting into those sensors and actuators and those very kind of small, minute devices in the industrial environment. So from an architectural standpoint and where our tool has visibility, we can see everything from levels 1 all the way up through levels 4 and 5. We don't read anything below level 1 because that's going to be serial communications, which is level 0. So that's not something we read.
Can you actually make that a little bit bigger? I'm getting a couple of requests to go and kind of make it a little bit bigger. Because I think that some students actually might be really, really new to the program and might actually not know OSI and TCP IP model. So I think that this would be a really interesting thing for them to like specifically look at.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I highly recommend, even if you can like take a screenshot of this and then put it up against or side by side with the TCP IP OSI models, it kind of really helps paint the picture of the different architectures and what you're looking at in IT versus OT. So it really shows that distinct difference there. And just to kind of piggyback on that, when we're deploying our technology, the tool that I'm showing you tonight, in an industrial environment, this is the model we reference to show folks, this is typically where we deploy that tool. And that tool is typically going to deploy between levels 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 of this model. And for us, that's going to ensure that we're capturing all of the right traffic from all of the right places in the network, and then pushing that up to the sort of user interface that we're looking at tonight. So it's kind of a two management console that it hooks into. And that management console is actually going to sit at the enterprise zone, which is tied to your IT environment. And it'll sit across sort of all of the different tool sets you're using on the IT side. So your SIM, if you're familiar with SIM, which are event management tools, and your other SOC, Security Operations Center tools that sit up in the IT realm, that's where our kind of console will sit. But all of our sensors will be below that, capturing the actual network traffic throughout the industrial environment. And I'll send you guys a copy of that after the call if that helps. But just sort of pivoting back to show you what we're looking at here. So I talked about earlier, ransomware being a big threat, right? If you kind of take a further glance at what's happening here, you'll notice that ransomware was actually detected as part of this particular threat that we're seeing. So from an incident response standpoint, this is sort of one of those juicy situations where you're seeing lateral movement, you're seeing exploitation of a remote service, you're kind of starting to put pieces together, but you also have a lot of the pieces right here at your fingertips already in the tool to figure out what's going on. Whereas if you are an incident responder or threat hunter kind of doing your own thing in an environment without tools, you're sort of off on your own, figuring it out on your own. So this is really where tools become hugely, hugely helpful, whether you're in IT or OT, to lean on for collecting these types of artifacts and being able to identify these artifacts on the fly to help you get to a resolution faster, because again, you don't want to be kind of dwelling on these things. But WannaCry is actually a form of ransomware. And that's exactly what we're seeing sort of unfold here. What is kind of interesting is you are able to trace back between assets where this might be coming from. So we're actually seeing this particular notification linked to a general use laptop and an engineering workstation. And again, that's where things start to get sort of dicey in an industrial environment, because you actually start to see these IT devices talking to the industrial environment, and IT devices notoriously can get, attacked and leveraged as an access vector into the environment. So it's kind of almost a weak point in the industrial environment where somebody can easily exploit these devices and cause undue kind of harm to the environment. So from just kind of a investigative standpoint or forensic standpoint, I may start to sort of backwards plan or backwards investigate and say, okay, well, I see this asset now tied to that particular threat. So I'm going to keep toggling between these two sort of assets and the notifications to sort of try and figure out what exactly is going on here. I could actually, if I wanted to, create a incident response case here if I wanted to. What you'll actually see, and I'm just going to flip this over since we're at kind of the 15-minute left mark, there's actually an incident response case already sort of preemptively made here for that WannaCry ransomware. And again, this is sort of the beauty of tools like this, is you have a built-in cyber analyst workbench, so that when you are in an incident response situation, you have the tools ready right here to create a case, an actual incident response case. And you'll see there's a hypothesis of what's happening in the environment with a justification of what's happening. And you'll see sort of tagged all of these little artifacts. So, I did this, I'm assuming this, I collected this evidence, I'm now doing this to engage with other folks on the team to figure out the impact to my other systems. And as a result of this kind of, documentation, which you would do anyway in any incident response situation, you're now looking at any of the notifications that we were looking at on the other side of the screen tied to this particular incident. So we're kind of triaging this, we're pulling in anything that's relevant to this particular incident response case. We're also pulling in any of the kind of raw traffic that identifies what protocol is talking across the network, what is the destination IP and address, and the source IP address. So all of these key things that you would typically collect as artifacts when you're doing incident response on IT, you do the same exact thing on the OT side. There are some more kind of complexities here, obviously, when you're dealing with industrial, sort of like I mentioned earlier. But nonetheless, your artifacts are going to be hugely important here as you try and figure out what exactly is happening. And then the last sort of thing here, and this is where it gets very sort of helpful, is having an incident response playbook. So I don't know if you all have dug into sort of the NIST standards for incident response before, or looked at what sort of policies and guidelines are out there surrounding what you do in an incident response situation. But all good sort of incident responders will have a incident response playbook that they lean on for how they go about what they do on a day-to-day when an incident arises. So in this particular case, we have, a handful of kind of pre-made incident response playbooks that our company came up with in our tool that we arm our customers with to help understand what's happening in the environment, to help walk them through the incident, and to help get to that mitigation or remediation in the environment when it comes to an incident response. And as a result of that, they're able to leverage this playbook and take a lot of the legwork out of their sort of day to day. So again, this really goes back to sort of the beauty of having a tool that sort of does it all for you. You still have to do the, analysis and the back end work, but a lot of the heavy lifting is done for you. Any questions on that? The last thing I'll sort of give you an idea of is vulnerabilities in the industrial environment. So when you look at the threats that are occurring and being detected on, vulnerabilities is a whole other topic, right? So vulnerabilities are, active things in a device that can be potentially exploitable by an adversary to kind of worm their way into your network. Again, super common on the IT side, but you also have them on the industrial side specific to the many devices that we run into. So as I mentioned earlier, you have things like a Rockwell device, a Siemens device, a Johnson Control, a Yokogawa, et cetera, et cetera. In this particular case, you'll see a number of Rockwell vulnerabilities. You'll see a number of Schneider vulnerabilities. And as you dig into these, you're able to actually get some really good context behind the vulnerability information here and understand as putting a hat on and saying, I'm a network owner and I'm trying to protect my network. What do I do with this information? You can actually leverage this to say, here is the risk to my environment with this particular vulnerability. So it's a very critical vulnerability that we're seeing. What do I do with that information? Well, the priority on this information is saying you need to do something now. So how do you put your kind of arms around that and what should you do? You'll actually be able to leverage guidance that is sort of tailored. And again, this depends on the tool you're using and the vendor you're working with. But in our particular case, we try to arm folks with as much information as possible. So we'll let them know, this is what you need to do. If there is a patch available, you may want to patch. And again, I mentioned earlier, you can't always patch in an industrial environment because of sort of the uniqueness, the complexities. You don't want to cause downtime in the environment. So in the case that you cannot patch, those are things we would also say to a customer. So we would give guidance and say, patching isn't actually the right thing to do in this case, and we're going to give you alternative guidance. And so our alternative guidance may be, close down this access to this particular port or restrict access to this particular port. So just ensuring you have something actionable to do without causing undue harm or disruption to your environment. So from a vulnerability perspective, arming folks with the right information and the accurate information to truly do something about it, and understanding what's going on in the environment to have that context. The other thing that's really unique from a vulnerability perspective is when you look at the risk that is brought into the environment for an industrial environment, the operational impact is a whole different playing field. When you're looking at IT, this isn't even something you would necessarily consider. When you're looking at OT, you're looking at, is this vulnerability going to cause an adversary to get into my network and take down my network and make it so that I don't know what's going on in my network? I don't have any view into my network. I can't even access my network. All of those things are things you don't want happening in an industrial environment. And you'll see in this particular case, this vulnerability will actually cause both of those kind of key operational impacts that you don't want to happen. So again, it's further reiterating the sort of risk and the priority of taking care of this particular vulnerability in the environment. See some questions in the chat. How do you see AI being involved in ICS OT systems? That's a funny question, because if you were to ask anyone in our company, AI and ICS/OT do not go together. So those are kind of two entirely different sort of spectrums of thought and technology. You know, I see AI again staying more on the side of things like Alexa and Google. So all things Internet of Things. If you look at industrial, you're not going to be talking about AI in industrial. That'll probably never be a conversation if I'm being honest. They're just not one and the same. They're not even close to the same type of technology and kind of how they interact. And with the kind of safety component there, I definitely don't see AI ever really branching over to industrial. The other question I see is, which would you prioritize vulnerabilities if you have multiple high severity? So if you have multiple high severity vulnerabilities, how would you prioritize them? That's what I'm reading that as. So in this particular case, again, since I'm leaning on sort of a tool that's doing a lot of this for me and categorizing all this for me, I would immediately say, as someone coming in here, so let's say I am a vulnerability analyst and that's my job, right? If that is my job, I would come in here and the first thing I would do is say, I'm going to prioritize all these critical and now sort of imminent vulnerabilities first. To give you an idea of some of the other ones that are in the system, these are some other ones that are in the system that aren't as high. They're still high as far as the risk level, but they're not critical. And you'll notice the priority actually says next on these. That actually really translates to, you don't have to worry about this right now, but as soon as you're done with basically all the other stuff that is critical and you have time to take care of these, that's when you would take care of these vulnerabilities. So when you have your next scheduled patching cycle or your next scheduled downtime, that's when you would take care of these vulnerabilities. So from a prioritization perspective, that's how you would take care of those. What is your day-to-day like? How often are you looking at dashboards? So if and this is again putting myself in the shoes of a customer, because I'm a solution architect at Dragos. So my day-to-day with customers looks like these types of conversations, breaking down the sort of nuances between IT and OT, helping them understand, what is the risk to their business, helping them understand what their use cases are. A lot of times we have folks saying, I don't know what's in my environment. So like the first use case I'm going to say is, okay, well, let's help you get visibility into your environment. And that's going to start with understanding the assets or devices in your environment. So my day-to-day can vary a lot. And I'm in a customer facing role. So I'm constantly interfacing with and talking to people across the industry, understanding their day-to-day challenges, and then figuring out ways that I can either help them or steer them in the right direction on kind of their journey in industrial, and help protect their business and their organization. As far as the dashboards go, these are, again, just really great for customers to use. So I myself, wouldn't be looking at a dashboard on a day-to-day. This is for, again, like a customer environment. I would help build the dashboards so we can do a lot of kind of customization on the dashboards to show different ways to portray data across the environment that the customer might be interested in, going back to sort of their needs and their challenges and figuring out what makes sense to portray to them. And a lot of this information can be used in reports. So if you think back to sort of an organization and things they would need to do in their day-to-day, if they have a boss to answer to at the end of the day, where their boss is like, I want to know what the environment looks like today, and I want to understand what devices are talking to each other. Like, these are the types of dashboards that you'd produce to say, okay, well, here's some pretty pictures without having to get into the weeds too much, and show a kind of graphical representation of what the environment looks like. There's a handful of other ones in here. So from a vulnerability standpoint, if you have someone in your leadership that's asking you, and let's say you're working at a manufacturing entity and your leadership says, I would like to know how many vulnerabilities are in the environment, and what are the stats on the vulnerabilities we're seeing, and that kind of information. This is, again, like another way to portray the data that's actually in your environment today, but in kind of like that very strategic format or tactical format, to really say, this is what's going on in the environment, these are the vulnerabilities, this is what we're seeing, and being able to provide that to higher ups to be able to kind of answer the mail on any questions, if that makes sense. So the dashboards are really great from a visual standpoint. You'll find that majority of vendors or tools out there in the market space, whether it's IT or OT, are going to have some iteration or version of a dashboard to show visualizations across the environment. That's kind of the number one thing that most executives want to see, is a visual of some sort. Any other questions? Best way to deploy the system. So if you go back to this PDF I was showing you, so when we deploy our system, whether it be, manufacturing, oil and gas, electric, et cetera, we are going to deploy in a way where we're deploying between levels 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 of this model. So our technology consists of sensors and then a management console. And the sensors are what gets deployed into these environments in that sort of notional way, right? I know, and everyone knows this, like architectures across the board are going to look different for everybody. So everyone's network is going to have kind of a different look, a different feel. But as far as how they're architected and where all the devices are in the network, that's generally always going to be the same. So when we deploy, that's from a notional perspective, how we deploy into the environment and get the visibility that we need. And we're generally going to consult with a, customer and say, okay, like, how many sensors do we actually need? Because it's going to depend on how big their environment is, how many assets they think they have, and that sort of thing. And the same thing stands true on the IT side. I've done, deployments for incident response where we're trying to figure out, where do we need to get the most visibility? Where do we need to be to ensure that we're getting sort of those edge use cases to ensure we have the best scope possible when we're trying to hunt for an adversary in the middle of an incident response, knowing it's an incident. So those kind of, scoping criteria go hand in hand, trying to figure out, what makes the most sense for those environments. Any other questions? A lot of ICS systems are not connected to the network. Are you the one that gets called when customers want to connect their system to the network to determine if that is a good option? That's a sort of interesting question, right? So yes and no. We offer, outside of the immediate tool I showed you all tonight, we have a team that actually goes out and they are the incident responders. They are the threat hunters. They are the vulnerability assessment folks. They're the pen testers. And they also run a number of assessments, such as tabletop exercises, if you're familiar with the term, architecture reviews, and a handful of other things. As part of those kinds of offerings, if we have, let's say, somebody come to us and say, that exact scenario, I want to, connect some more devices to my network, or I want to get, more IT devices connected, or whatever it may be the scenario, and they're looking for sort of someone to consult with, that could very well be a service that they come to us for and say, we want to get an idea if this is a good idea. That's a very plausible thing. There's also a ton of kind of consulting firms out there that do similar things as well, where it's just sort of a consulting relationship with folks in either IT or industrial to really figure out if those types of things are a good option. Another thing they could say is, let's do like a tabletop exercise to figure out, if we do run through this scenario and we do connect other devices to the network, are we postured to respond to an incident if we connect something and something goes wrong? So there's it's a very, I think, heavy question with a lot of different answers to it. Anything else? And you guys have been very interactive. I really appreciate it.
Think we have any other final questions here in person? If anybody else on Zoom would like to ask. Oh, I think that was all the questions. Oh, I'm sorry. We have one question right over here.
Was there another question?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. She's asking and I was going to repeat it back. Yeah.
And I'm trying to get in. And warn people, hey, look. Turn to this side, then they can come this way.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So I believe the question would be, yeah. So the question I believe is as your position, you will be defending an entire infrastructure, but you have your attackers attacking from one direction. I believe, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, how would you handle, let's say you're being attacked from one direction on your infrastructure, and then you suddenly get an attack from, let's say, another angle?
How would I handle that? Or like from an incident response perspective, what you would do?
Give me one second. Say that one more time. The Oh, okay. Gotcha. I think I think I follow you. So yeah, would you be able to like pre-strengthen let's say infrastructure in turn, so like pre-strengthen a surface, and then if you get called in, you would respond in a different direction? So pen testing?
I think I understand the question. So two parts, right? If, again, to the point earlier about in general, if you're facing, let's say, an attack and then something comes out of the blue from another direction on the network, and now that's attacking, my sort of perspective on that is, if you can shut down the network, no one wants to do that, but if you can shut it down so that you can kind of prevent further infection, don't unplug entirely, because you want to still be able to grab any artifacts off of the network to investigate what happened and what occurred. And then if possible, like go into a safety mode when you kind of reboot. And that's generally, I'm just saying in general for like the IT side. Now, if you wanted to do something like a pen test is a good way to understand where your weak points are in your network. evaluate those weak points and then build your security controls up, build your kind of defense in depth strategy to further prevent any sort of attacks or anything of that nature. Does that kind of help answer the question? Did that answer the question, Jennifer, from the classroom?
She was reinstating another example as well, but I believe it did answer her question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. Another really good question in the chat regarding the Dragos platform. Is there any pushback or issue with other vendors' dashboard integrations? For example, Schneider Electric Structure works for asset management. So I'm not familiar with Schneider Electric Structure works for asset management, but to the point of dashboarding, that's usually not an issue. If we have an integration with a technology partner like a Schneider or somebody else in the market, those usually, don't present any issue, if that makes sense. Like, we partner just like any other vendor in the space would with a lot of the sort of industrial technology vendors that are out there, whether it be a Schneider, whether it be a Siemens, again, whether it be a Rockwell. And as part of those partnerships, we work to develop out integrations and technology solutions that benefit sort of the wider breadth of audience in the industrial space so that they can, on their day-to-day, log into both solutions, leverage the data from both solutions, and have some version or form of automation, sort of like I talked about earlier in the presentation about the threat intel automation, but even going beyond that and automating some of the sort of asset inventory between different offerings and solutions, if that makes sense.
Just about out of time. Ms. Barton, we want to thank you so much for taking the time and talking about Dragos and the platform. Thank you, everybody, for showing up as well. Give a round of applause, please. Thank you. Can they follow you over on LinkedIn, stay in touch with you?
Absolutely. I highly encourage you all, if you want to connect on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me, message me, ask questions. Highly willing to engage, send additional resources, point you to other folks with other expertise if there's certain roles you're looking for and things of that nature. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you again so much for being here with us today. If there's no other further questions, I believe this meeting is adjourned.